Got it, thanks. Okay, well, I'm going to read today from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, beginning with verse 28. And Jesus is speaking here. And here's what he says. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I'll just call your attention to the fact that the invitation that he gives here is personal. He says, "Come to me." Then he says something else very much like that in the next verse, verse 29. In the previous verse he said, "Come to me, unto me." 29 he says, "Take my yoke upon you." Now a yoke, as you know, is a thing that joins two different things together. When we're talking about agriculture or animals, it hooks two animals together, and that's what it is a metaphor for. It's a symbol or a metaphor for our coming to him and being connected to him. That's what the obvious symbolism is. And then after he says that, "Take my yoke upon you," or come into a relationship with me, or come into connection with me. "Come to me" is what he said in the previous verse. A yoke talks about being connected to him. "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me." Now, when it says "of me," in the Greek language, prepositions like "of" generally just mean pertaining to. And so you could understand it as learn about me or learn from me. You could take it either way, and I think both are true. The first thing he says is learn of me, learn about me, or learn from me. First thing he says, and this is interesting, of all the things he might have said, to learn about him, of all the wide variety of things that one might say about Christ, here's what he says. Just think of all the different things you might, want to observe about him. Here's what he says: "Learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart." To me, that's kind of surprising that he puts that first and foremost and puts the emphasis on that. "I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And then verse 30 says, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." Remember, the yoke is symbolic of our connection to him. So you could say it represents the Christian life, because that's what the Christian life is, a life connected to or in reference to Christ. That's why it's called the Christian life. He says it's easy. Did you notice that? It's easy. It's light. It's not a burden. It's not a burdensome thing. It's not a load to carry. It's not an obligation, not tasks to carry out. He says it's easy. Now, going back to verse 29, I just want to focus on the very thing that he points out as the first thing or the primary thing or the most important thing we learn of him, whether that means about him or from him. It's all the same. He says, "I am meek and lowly in heart." Now, those words, we have a general idea of what they mean. Let me give you that from a couple of other translations, and it sort of brings it into a sharper focus. The Contemporary English Version says, "I am gentle and humble." Instead of meek, it says gentle. Instead of lowly in heart, it says humble. Gentle and humble. The easy-to-read version says, "I am kind, and I do not make myself important. I will help you." This tells us what he's like. He's talking about his character or his personality. Now, sometimes, these words are easier to understand, or they come into even sharper focus when we compare them to the antonyms. Now, antonym means words that are the opposite. So let me give you the antonyms of gentle. See, he says, "I am gentle and humble." Meek and lowly in heart. It means gentle and humble. Antonyms are words that mean the opposite of gentle. In other words, these are words that describe what he's not. rude, disrespectful, aggressive, brutal, crude, and vulgar. Those are the antonyms of gentle. So those kind of things, he's not like that. Antonyms of humble, or words that mean the opposite of humble, are these: proud, overbearing, egotistical, pretentious, pompous, vain. Now, when he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and the first thing he says is, I am gentle and humble. And we just read all those words that are excluded from that. He's not any of those things. Of course, that's easy for us to understand that Christ is not like that. Now, he's describing what he's like. He's describing what we learn about him when we come into connection with him. So why does he want that? Why does he want for us to learn that? In other words, why is that so important that he emphasizes that first and foremost? Well, to get a lot of the answers, the why answers. You know, the Gospels tell us what? The what story, if I can say it that way. The Gospels describe what Jesus did and what he said, and they tell us the story of his life and his death and resurrection, but they don't tell us the why in most cases. We don't find out the why until we go further into the New Testament and we read the epistles, especially the epistles. That means letters, of course. The letters, especially of the Apostle Paul. And I realize that some people have a problem with the Apostle Paul. I don't. In fact, I think he's essential for our understanding. Sometimes the Apostle Paul is accused of inventing what we now think of as Christianity. That's not true at all, as though there is some conflict or some difference between what Paul taught and what Jesus taught. I don't find that at all. I think people who assert that aren't reading very carefully, or perhaps even reading at all. You see, the Apostle Paul, as you know, because I talk about it all the time, was not one of the 12 disciples. He was chosen afterwards. And if you take seriously the book of Acts, we're presented 3 different times with the story of Paul's conversion and the appearance of Jesus to him on the road to Damascus when he was then called Saul, and he was persecuting Christians and arresting them and trying to stamp it out, basically. They considered it to be a cult or a heresy. The leaders of the temple and Saul, as he was then called, was attempting to snuff out this heresy or this cult called Christianity and this followers of Christ, you know. And Jesus interrupted him in the pursuit of that and gave him a commission. And he said, I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a witness of the things you've seen and in the things I will appear to you, and I will send you to the Gentiles to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light. Now, when you say open somebody's eyes, that's what Jesus literally told him. That doesn't mean literally like as though blind. It's another metaphor for and give understanding. And what he got understanding about was what was accomplished by Jesus in his redemptive work on the cross, which, as Paul tells us in his epistles, it was before it was accomplished, it was hidden or it was a secret. And Paul was given the revelation. So you find out the why when we read Paul's epistles. So we're going to read from a passage in Ephesians in just a moment, but let me just give you a little overview of the part. We're going to start with Ephesians chapter 4, Torrin, in verse 1. But let me give you the lead up to that before we get there. When Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, he generally, in his letters, follows a little pattern, and he does so in the book of Ephesians. In chapter 1, he generally does this. He'll present the gospel as he understands it. And the gospel, as far as Paul presents it, is not a message about you and what you're supposed to do. It's a message exclusively about God and what he did for you through Christ. It's all about God proactively doing something on our behalf through Christ. And when you read Ephesians chapter 1, if you read it carefully, you'll be struck by the fact that over and over and over again, Paul makes reference to our connection to Christ. Just like Jesus did when he said, take my yoke upon you. We said a yoke is symbolic of our connection to him, our our relationship with him. And Paul refers to that again and again by using the expression in him or in whom or in Christ. He uses that expression or something like it at least 7 times just in the first chapter of Ephesians, referring to what is now true of us by virtue of our connection to Christ. And by the way, our connection to Christ is not established by us doing something really difficult or hard, or climbing up some mountaintop to get to some high plateau of spirituality. It's just simply on our part our decision to trust him. On his part, in a relationship there's 2 sides, there's 2 parts. There's no relationship unless there's 2 sides. On his side, he entered into a relationship with us 2,000 years ago when he carried in his body something very personal of ours, very intimate, very private even. He carried our sins in his own body. So he entered into a relationship with us, began it 2,000 years ago. And here we are 2,000 years later when we hear about it and we make the decision to trust in what he did. Now we enter into a union with him or a connection to him, or as he said, take my yoke upon. We're now connected to him. He started it, and we believe in it or trust in it, and now we're connected. And so Paul talks about what's now true again and again. He says, this is now true. We've received adoption. We have become beneficiaries of redemption, which means forgiveness of sins. He says, he just lists all these things in Ephesians chapter 1, talking about what's true of us based on our connection to him. And finishing up chapter 1 by saying, it's so big it's hard to wrap your mind around it. He says, he says, I'm praying for you, Ephesians, that your eyes will be opened and you'll come into understanding of how big this thing is. And he uses as an example the fact that when God raised Jesus from the dead, in his mind, he raised us from the dead, gave us the same new life at the same time. And in chapter 2, he continues with that idea, and he says, remember that at one time you were separated from God, alienated from God, but he didn't, I'm paraphrasing now, God didn't care about that. By grace you're saved. He interrupted or intervened, and though we deserved his judgment, he didn't give us that. He gave us his mercy instead. And then in chapter 2 is where we find that famous verse in verse 8, by grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. Emphasizing again that this is all God's work we're talking about, and we've come into this condition Paul calls salvation, which I like to say salvation is just a word that means safe. A condition of safety and security where God is concerned. And it's all his work, and all we bring to it is just one thing, not 10 things, not 100 things. We just bring our faith. We say, I choose to trust in him. Now we've entered into a condition of safety where God is concerned. And you can tell when you read Ephesians, any of Paul's letters, you can tell that Paul is really excited about this message because he just goes on and on and on. He elaborates about it. In chapter 3 of Ephesians, he talks about his own commission. And now he was commissioned to reveal this truth. In fact, just as an example, Torrin, could you back up to chapter 3? Give me Ephesians 3, verse 9. This sums it up, I think, just in a nutshell. He says, and to make all men see that means not see with your eyes necessarily, but understand. That's what he means. Perceive. To make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery. That's a weird expression. Fellowship in the Greek language is koinonia. That's the Greek word. It simply means, we say fellowship and we think we mean like, let's meet after church and have a cup of coffee and talk about the weather. We say that's fellowship, that like being friendly. It means something much more than that. In the Greek language, it's koinonia. It means a life shared in common, a common life. He's talking about that union, that connection. Not only between us and Christ, but between us and each other, because we're all joined to Christ. He says, and to make all men see what is this common life we hold in common. And he calls it a mystery, which from the beginning of the world has been hid in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ. He says, this is what I've been commissioned to do, to let everybody see what this thing is a mystery. And he's been elaborating on it and talking about it. Now what Paul generally does is, after he presents the gospel, after he talks about what God has done for us through Christ and lays out all the details of it. Then he switches gears and he begins to talk to his readers about, so if you believe this, if you accept this, if you are part of this life in common with Christ, how do you put it into practice? How do you make it practical? How do you apply it to your life? And so that's what he begins to do in chapter 4, Ephesians chapter 4. So Torrin, now I'm ready for that. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. And I think I'm going to turn there so I don't have to read through the branches of the tree to see it. And it's okay. I don't mind doing that. And I like the trees. I don't want to move the trees. I don't mind pulling them out of the way. But, I'm going to read right out of my own Bible. Okay, so Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. He is starting what he considers to be the practical side. This is how do you apply all of this truth to your life? So here's what he says. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, he says that because he has been imprisoned on behalf of preaching the gospel. He says, I beseech you, that means I'm begging you, that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called. Now, when he says walk, again, it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the way you live or your Christian life. That he says that you conduct yourself in a way that is, he says, worthy of the vocation or the calling to which you've been called. The word worthy could be understood as in an appropriate way, appropriate to. The word worthy in the Greek language is axios. It means appropriate to or befitting or congruous. In other words, what's appropriate? What's the appropriate way for a Christian to behave? Now, when he starts to say this, if we didn't read any further and he just said that, our imaginations might run wild and we might think he's talking about all kinds of various things that some people think are the marks of a Christian, and mostly what people think of is a lot of external things. But I think it's fascinating. When I first noticed this, it really caught my attention. You remember what we read back in the Gospels where Jesus said, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Talking about the relationship we have with him. He said, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. And then he said, the first thing you're going to find out is, I am meek and lowly in heart. We said it meant humble. Now notice when Paul here says, now, you readers in Ephesus, and we're reading over their shoulders, I want you to conduct yourself in a way that's worthy or appropriate to, how should a Christian live? Look at the very first thing he says. Of all the things he could say, look at what he says in verse 2. With all lowliness and meekness and long-suffering, forbearing one another in love. Now that should remind you of the very thing that Jesus said. That word lowliness and meekness, that's what Jesus said about himself. He said, this is the first thing you're going to learn about me. And Paul said this is the most important thing, let's say it that way. This is the first thing he introduces here. Let me read this to you from some other translations. Christian Standard Bible says, with all humility and gentleness. Those are the identical words that Jesus used. As we conduct our lives as Christians, or as representatives of Christ, or as those who are in a state of relationship with Christ, the exact same words. Humility and gentleness with patience, bearing with one another in love. The easy to read version. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient. Accept each other with love. Here's another one. This is called the Expanded Bible. This is a different translation. Always be humble, gentle, patient, accepting, putting up with or bearing with one another in love. I think it's interesting to me that this is where he puts the primary emphasis. Same thing that Jesus did. Not on a lot of things we might expect, and I don't know what we imagine, but this is what is the thing he's most concerned about or most interested in. Are these things that we would, in our minds, think are very kind of insignificant or not that important. He said, no, these are the most important things. the first things that he mentions. And as we go on reading in chapter 4, I'm not going to take your time to read everything. In the verses that follow this, he talks about endeavoring to keep a bond of unity, and he talks about how we all have different gifts and we all do different things, and he talks about himself. He talks about how ministers all have a different function, they all do different things, but it's all aimed at bringing to light or bringing into focus the life of Christ so that we can, well, let's see, here's an example, verse 15. If you skip down to verse 15, Torrin, he says, but speaking the truth in love, we may grow up into him. That's interesting. Grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. What that implies to me is the goal is that we grow up into being like him. That's what that, I believe it says. Verse 16 says, from whom the whole body, that's the body of Christ, the church, the Christians, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working of the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. He's talking about the church building itself up together with this word, love, which is a way of summarizing all those other words we were looking at. Let's skip down a little bit. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Look at verse 21. He's still talking about the practicalities of living the Christian life. Let's skip down to verse 21. If so be that you have heard him and have been taught by him as the truth is in Jesus. Verse 22 says that you put off concerning the former conversation the old man which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. Conversation, the word in our usage in modern day English, we think of conversation as talking. But 400 years ago, when the King James translation was made, they used the word conversation in a slightly different way, and that's what's reflected here. It doesn't mean necessarily talking with one another. It is connected to that. What the King James translators, what they meant by the word conversation 400 years ago was the way you live your life in relation to others. And so that might include talking, but it's just in general how you relate to one another. So he says, concerning the former way that you might have done that, he said, put that off. In other words, like you might take off an old moth-eaten, ratty old garment, like a coat. You might take it off, put it aside, and he's got a new coat, something new to put on. Verse 23 says, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, or that means think differently than you thought before. And that's why he's writing this, by the way, to give you a perspective to help you change the way you think. And verse 24 says that you put on the new man, which after God, that means like God, is created in righteousness and true holiness. So when he talks about put on the new man, he's referring back to be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new way of thinking. The new man, of course, is in reference to Christ and our relationship with Christ. And notice this, he says, like God, in the likeness of God, we might say, created in righteousness and true holiness. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but when I read expressions like that, it makes me stop and ponder. What do you mean, true holiness? Well, when I read that, first thing that comes to mind is, well, there must be an artificial one or a fake one. You know, in other words, if he says the new man or the proper Christian life, he's talking about how do we walk in a way that's appropriate to our status as Christians, our life as Christians. And he says this new life or this new man or this new relationship with Christ and the way that we live and put it into practice, he says it's created. That means it's something that God has made. It's not something that you create. You're not the creator. We just put it on. We just adopt it and receive it, you might say. We renew our minds to accept it. And he says it's a life that's created in righteousness and true holiness. Now, that made me stop and think. When it says true holiness, that means there must be an artificial one or a fake one. You know what that made me think of? That reminded me of something Jesus said when he had a little conflict with the Pharisees. Do you remember in the Gospels, if you've ever read the Gospels straight through, you find out that there's, you know what we generally do when we read in the Gospels is we pick out passages that speak to us or that we like or that are helpful, like I just read a moment ago. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, 29, 30. Come to me, all ye that labor and heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. I'm meek and lowly in heart. You'll find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. We read those because they speak to our hearts and they help us. But if you listen to if I say listen to because I've done that before, listen on audio books to the gospel. First time I ever did that, what struck me above everything else is how much conflict there is in the Gospels, how much fighting. And it's conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus. They're constantly finding fault with him, constantly trying to trip him up, constantly plotting how they can, arrest him, how they can trap him in his words, and jealous of him. They're afraid that the people are following him. It's just constant conflict. That really jumps out at you when you read the gospel straight through. And so Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, towards the end of his ministry, just before it's going to conclude, he comes into the temple and he confronts them. And he says, "Woe to you Pharisees." He just calls them out, as we would say. And he says, here's what his fault was. Here's what he accused them of. Here's how he presented them. He says, "Woe to you Pharisees, for you are hypocrites." He called them hypocrites. He said, here's why. Because you make clean the outside of the cup, and you appear to men to be righteous. But the inside of the cup is full of bad things. He says, you should have cleaned the inside of the cup first, and then the outside would automatically be clean. You see, he called them hypocrites because they engaged in presenting a life that looked righteous. Well, that's what Paul means here when he says that our lives should be sincere or true holiness and not the artificial kind. And there is this little through line that goes through the whole history of the church. Periodically, people will come along and they'll think that by looking on the outside, by assessing things from an outward human point of view, they'll look around at one another and they'll say, well, the church is too worldly. And especially these people over here, not me. I'm holy. In fact, I will call myself holiness and holy, and everybody else doesn't live up to my standards. And there's this this crops up again and again and again in the history of the church, kind of a dividing of the church into this group over, the church is just way too worldly. And so we need to separate ourselves and have a church that's holy. In fact, sometimes they even put holiness in the name of their new church. Now, and if you read about it, which I've done, and I think it's interesting. I've got a book in the office called Denominations in the United States, and it talks about all the splits and the splits from the other splits, and this group splitting from that group, then they split again. That's generally the reason they split. And they split into all these little fragmented groups because they think that everybody's not holy enough. And generally what it all boils down to when you say, well, what's the issue? It's just a lot of trivial things. And I have my little list here that I read sometimes, and I finally tracked this down. Elliot and Isabella were here a few weeks, well, it's been longer than that. And they asked me where'd that quote come from. Well, I tracked it down. It's a book called Early Pentecostalism in the United States. And it was from a review of that book. And here's what it says. Like other evangelical movements, 20th century Pentecostals were opposed to all of the standard sins, of course, but that was just the start. At one time or another, the author says, Pentecostal holiness enthusiasts began to add to the list things to avoid if you wanted to be holy. Bands and baseball, boating, bowling, circuses, fireworks, football, loitering, parades, skating, valentines and zoos. They denounced amusement parks, beach parties, big dinners, chatting on the phone, Christmas trees, crossword puzzles, home movies, ice cream socials, kissing bees, scenic railroad trips, and visiting relatives or going on automobile trips on Sundays. And then the author says, the more pleasures modern life became made available, the more Pentecostal holiness practitioners insisted on the need to resist them. And in one of my books that I was reading about this, the thing that really caught my attention was the necktie issue. I've mentioned this before. It just said this church split from this other church because of the necktie issue, but it didn't explain what it was. And I had to ask around, and I found a woman told me one time she was a member of one of those churches, and she wasn't laughing about it either. To me, I thought it was amusing, but she wasn't laughing. She said, well, the necktie issue is that the decision was made that if you wear a necktie, you are being like the world, because bankers wear neckties and politicians wear neckties. And so if you want to be separate from the world and really be holy, then you wear an open-collared shirt, because to wear a tie makes you worldly. Now, I hope by reading that list, and the reason I always bring that up and read that list is so you can see that that's all trivial and unimportant and nonsensical. And the whole idea of whether you wear a necktie or not, although you see how holy I am today by my open-collared shirt, that's just because I'm too lazy to put on a necktie. I'd have to unbutton these little buttons, you see, to put it on. But, you know, I might surprise you one day and put my necktie on. Then you'll have to make up your own mind which side of the issue you're going to be on. But you see, when Paul here says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind and put on the new man, which is created in righteousness and true holiness, I said all of that to contrast. All those things I just told you about are trivial and unimportant, even though some people embrace those things mistakenly and think that that's going to make them holy or some mark of their holiness. Well, then the question then becomes, well, what is the true holiness? What is the reality then? If that stuff is the trivial and the nonsensical and not true holiness, what is the real or the authentic? What does he mean by that? Well, what I've discovered is if you ever have a question about what does he mean and what can you be more explicit, well, just go on reading. So let's go on reading. After he says this in verse 24, verse 25 says, wherefore means because of this, for this reason, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Verse 26 says, be ye angry and sin not, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Now that's a little awkward in King James translation. It almost sounds like he's saying be angry. I don't think that's what he means. I think what he's saying is if you get angry, get over it right away. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. Here's what the Expanded Bible says. If you get angry, do not sin. Be sure to stop being angry before the end of the day. Well, I think that's a good way to sum it up. Here's what the Phillips translation says. If you're angry, be sure it's not out of wounded pride or a bad temper. Now, that really cuts to the point, doesn't it? If you're angry, be sure it's not out of wounded pride or a bad temper. And I think many times you can track it down, you can trace it back to exactly that. There really is no such thing as righteous anger. There's really no such thing as an anger that's positive or good. Never go to bed angry. Don't give the devil that sort of a foothold. Or in other words, get over it, is what he's saying. You know, you can't help it sometimes. Sometimes things rub you the wrong way, but he's saying if that happens, get over it. Verse 27 says, neither give place to the devil. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing that is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Verse 29 says, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. Well, in case you wonder what he means by that, that's like one side, the opposite, the negative side, but here's the positive side. But that which is good to the edifying, to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace to the hearers. Or in other words, he's saying, when you talk or when you speak or when you're talking to somebody, think about them and say things that are going to be beneficial for the person you're speaking to. That's really all he's after here. You notice how each one of these things that I read are about look at the needs and the life and the other person. Don't do anything that's going to hurt someone else. Don't do anything that's going to, don't steal from them, in other words. Don't be angry with them, in other words. Don't lie to them. You see, he's mentioned all these things talking about putting in perspective your life in relation to another person. Think about what they need. What can I say that will be beneficial for this person? What can I do that will be beneficial for this other person? It reminds me of, this could all come under the heading of what Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, and what Paul began this passage with when he said, walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you're called in all gentleness and humility. Those are words that imply a kind of interaction with other people. But let's go on reading. Verse 30, and grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you are sealed into the day of redemption. Notice that in the context here, the only thing he's mentioned as being grieving to the Holy Spirit is handling other people with roughness or with meanness or being angry. Those are the only things he's mentioned here as grieving the Holy Spirit. Why? Because God is not like that. Jesus said, when you come to me, when you take my yoke upon you and learn from me, this is what you're going to find out I'm like. I'm gentle, I'm humble, and you'll find rest for your souls. And now what's coming across here, I hope, as Paul is spending really just a whole chapter elaborating on this, is we are like little miniature reproductions, or we're meant to be. You see, this is something we learn over time. You know, we're not instantly that in our outward expression, but this is why he said we grow up into him. We grow up into being like him. And hopefully, you know, a year from now, you'll be further along that road of being like him in this respect than you are now. And that's true with all of us. Grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you are sealed into the day of redemption. And by the way, don't let that make you nervous. Some people read something like that and they get frightened. He's not going to throw you overboard. In fact, he says you're sealed. That means you're tied in. You're sealed into the day of redemption. And then he's not through yet talking about this. Notice how this is all really just saying the same thing. Verse 31 says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Those are all words that imply the same kind of frame of mind. Here's what the Contemporary English version says. Stop being bitter and angry and mad at others. Don't yell at one another, and certainly don't curse one another or ever be rude. That makes it kind of plain, doesn't it? And then finally in verse 32 he says, you know, as though the thought hasn't got across yet, just in case, he sums it up this way. Be kind to one another. Why does he say that? Why does he emphasize this so much? Because that's the Spirit of Christ. That's what Christ is like. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle. I'm kind. Be kind to one another. Tender-hearted. Look at this. Forgiving one another. See, that implies that there might be periodically some kind of offense. And that's just part of life, you know. It is. There might be an offense. But how do we react? Well, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. Did you notice that he puts the word hath, a past tense word? He says, God, for Christ's sake, what that means is because of what Christ has done, because of Christ's redemptive work, we could say, on the cross, the result is God has forgiven you. So he's saying take that as your guide, or as your, you might say, way to put things into perspective. Think about how God has treated us, and then you put that as your model for how to treat others. This all comes under the heading of, he says, remember what he said back in verse 1. He said, I want you to walk in a way or live in a way that's appropriate to or congruent with what's now true of you. You've entered into a relationship with God where he's dismissed all of your sins. Well, that's the wrong way to say it. He's already dealt with them. They're already gone. We're already forgiven. So he says treat one another the same way. Now, Paul didn't put chapter 5 here. He didn't end and say, okay, I'm going to start a new chapter. He just went right on, and I don't really understand why the translators put chapter 5 here, because in chapter 5 and verse 1, he's really talking about the same thing, and he says it just in slightly different words. Chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Be ye therefore followers of God as dear children." That's saying pretty much the same thing that he's been saying. In the Amplified Translation, it says, "Be imitators." Imitate, or be followers. Imitators of God. I think, I back up sometimes and think about the Apostle Paul creating this letter. I don't think he took a pen and wrote it. What he says in Romans, if you read Romans at the end of the whole book, at the end of the whole letter, he's greeting everyone, and then there's a little greeting, and it says, "I, so-and-so, the one who wrote this letter, greet you." He's the scribe who took it down. Paul, that makes it clear that Paul just stood there speaking it. He was just like saying it out, speaking it out, and then there was you might say, a secretary taking it down. So as I visualize Paul, he's, wherever he is when he wrote this, he's thinking about these Christians in Ephesus, and he's thinking about their lives, and he wants to keep them on track. He wants to make sure that things are going smoothly and working as they're supposed to be, and want to keep them in the correct path. And he's just trying to get this across, that people, this is what the Christian life is. This is what's important. This is what the primary goal of it is. This is the whole essence of Christianity, these things that I'm expressing here. And he's just trying to find some way to put it into language that will come across and make an impact. So he says, "Be followers of God as dear children." Verse 2 says, "And walk in love." And if you don't understand, he says, "As Christ has loved us." You notice how he keeps comparing it to the way he's treated us. "As Christ has loved us and given himself for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor." Now, the reason he says that is he's putting everything in the context of, think about what's needful for the person you're interacting with. What do they need? Not think, what do I need? This person's not meeting my needs. Sometimes people say that. No, you're not supposed to look at it that way. You're supposed to say, what does this person need? What can I say to them that will be a blessing to them? He used that word edifying. Torin, could you go back to verse 1 and read this from the Message? I really like what the Message says here. And I know I've read this before. I know you've heard me, quote this before, read it. But that doesn't stop us from reading it again. I think it's all still good. Watch what God does, and then you do it. Like children who have earned proper behavior from their parents. That really is the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to look at God and how he acts towards us, and then, do you ever stop and think, what's this all about anyway, this Christianity? What's the goal? I mean, what's the purpose of it? What's the end result? What is it headed towards? Well, this is what it's headed towards, that we as human beings are not just human beings kind of doing our own thing, but we're reflecting the nature of God, the nature of Christ, which, as he defined for us, like the headline, the top most important thing, he's gentle and he's humble. And we're supposed to reflect that kind of attitude. You might say, well, that doesn't sound very dramatic. That doesn't sound very big. Well, it must be big for him because he put that as the main thing he emphasized. So here, Paul's doing the same thing. Watch what God does and then you do it, like children who have earned proper behavior from their parents. Let's get the next verse. Mostly what God does is love you. If you want to know what it's all about, if you want to know what the Christian life is, what Christianity is, this is mostly what it's about. The love of God becoming real in this world. Mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him. Learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, or that is to say, he's not trying to manipulate us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. Well, I think that's really great. And I think when we read things like that periodically, it helps us to recenter our focus of our attention. And I think really that's kind of the main thing we come to church for, is to refocus our attention on the things that are the most important things. Okay, that's all I have for today.